Okay, now that you've finished the section on ownership, let's talk about some of the key concepts that are important for you to know. First of all, there's a word called freehold. Freehold means ownership. Freehold and ownership are synonymous. They're interchangeable. So if someone's talking about, well, I have a freehold or I own a freehold estate, you're talking about an estate and ownership. The estate and ownership we work mostly with in real estate is called fee simple absolute. But sometimes we shorten that term and just call it fee or fee ownership. That's F-E-E, fee ownership. It's an old English word, and it comes from English common law. Sometimes you'll also see it called fee simple, which is kind of halfway there. So you have fee, fee simple, and fee simple absolute. All three of those terms are used, and what they mean is the most comprehensive type of ownership that someone can have. This is ownership that will last for an indeterminate period of time. So, in other words, there's no strings attached that could sever that ownership. Now, don't misunderstand. People habitually go out and get loans against their properties in order to buy their homes or commercial buildings, whatever they might be desirous of buying. But that's a different concept. You can't get a loan on a piece of real estate, in most cases, practically speaking, unless you have fee simple absolute title. And of course, if you don't pay back that loan, then you could be facing foreclosure. We're not talking about that. We're talking about, when you're talking about this indeterminable amount of time, that there's no strings attached. That there's a type of ownership called defeasible fee or determinable fee, where someone could give you a property, let's say your great uncle, and he says, you're going to own this property as long as you do this or you don't do that. This is a type of weird science ownership, and it's not something we work with that often in real estate. Another example of this weird science ownership would be a life estate. And these types of estates, these types of ownership, they are ownership, but they're ownership with strings attached. And we don't work with them that often in real estate, but they're terms you need to know for the real estate exam. Well, because quite frankly, there's such juicy terms, any decent exam writer's got to use them to see if you understand them. So have a good feeling for fee simple determinable or determinable fee. Sometimes you interchange the order of the words used there. And just understand that it's not something we see a lot except for your test. What you will be dealing with quite a bit, practically speaking, are how people are vested in title. If they own it alone, they own it in severalty. They're severed from everybody else, no big deal. But if they own it with someone else, it's some sort of joint ownership. And there's different ways these joint ownerships can be structured. The default or most common would be tenants in common. Now, I say it's most common because if you don't try to do the other one right, which is called joint tenancy, this is what you end up with. You end up with tenants in common. Tenants in common only requires one unity, and that is the unity of possession. The other type of joint ownership is joint tenancy. And the difference between joint tenancy and tenants in common primarily is that joint tenancy has this right of survivorship. In other words, the last man or woman standing gets the property. If there were three owners under joint tenancy and the other co-owner started dying, as the first one died, all of a sudden your 1/3 share went to 1/2 share. And then the second one dies, and all of a sudden the surviving owner owns it in severalty. They own 100% of it. Joint tenancy, the main difference is that it has that right of survivorship. Tenants in common doesn't have a right of survivorship. If you own something jointly with three owners under tenants in common and one of the owners dies, his or her share goes to their survivors. It goes to their heirs or whoever they want to give it to. They might want to give it to a nonprofit type group, but their share will be distributed according to their will or the state laws that are in effect that govern that transfer of property. Joint tenancy, however, it goes to the other owners. Tenants in common goes to their heirs. There's another type of joint ownership that's really, really close to joint tenancy, and that's called tenants by the entireties. Tenancy by the entireties or tenants by the entireties is only for married people, people that are legally and lawfully married, and it's a lot like joint tenancy in that it requires 4 unities. The 4 unities can be remembered with the acronym PITT, P-I-T-T, possession, interest, time, and title. PIT, P-I-T-T. You have to have PIT for both joint tenancy and tenancy by the entireties. The difference in tenancy by entireties, one additional requirement, is that you have to be legally and lawfully married. Under joint tenancy, each individual owner, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, doesn't matter, can give away, can transfer, can sell their percentage interest. But under tenancy by entireties, you can't sell your interest unless you have your spouse's approval. Very few people use tenancy by the entireties just primarily because they may not even know about it, but it is legal in Utah. So you have joint tenancy, tenants in common, and tenancy by the entireties. Tenancy in common, one unity only, unity of possession. Joint tenancy and tenancy by the entireties, PIT, P-I-T-T, possession, interest, time, and title. Possession, everyone has an equal right of possession. That's the one you have to have for tenants in common as well. Interest, it must be equal interest. If you ever see a situation where someone owns more of a property than someone else, like one owner owns 75% and the other owner only owns 25%, it has to be tenants in common, because it can't be the other two, because you have to have equal interest shares. Time, the owners were all vested in title at the same exact time. If you had a joint tenancy and one of the owners, let's say there are 3 owners, one of the owners sold their third share to someone else, what would happen is that the original 2 tenants or the original 2 owners still own their interest as a joint tenants. So what happens there, if owner A or owner B died, the other one would get their shares. But owner D, the new guy that just came on the block, he bought his share from owner C. He came into title at a different time. So in regards to his 1/3 share interest, he is that's right, tenant in common. So if he dies, his third interest goes to his heirs. A or B die, well, the other one gets their interest. Kind of an interesting mix of how things happen there, but great test material, and also things you need to understand when you're out practically doing the business. Now, if you had an A, B, and D situation, how many signatures would you need on the listing? A's, B's, and D's. All owners must sign the listing contract, and all owners must sign the sales agreement. And if one owner is not available, well, then you're going to have to use some sort of electronic means of transferring to that person to get their signature, or you could go with the power of attorney. But all this needs to be worked out in advance before you get those offers in on the property. Sometimes you need to prepare properly so that the property is marketable and it's ready to go. There's another kind of ownership used in just a few states in the U.S., and that's called community property. These are states that primarily had either French or Spanish origins, like California, for example, is a community property state. So is Idaho, our neighbor to the north. But Utah is not a community property state. Whoever is vested in title in Utah is the owner of that property. But community property states, either there's some peculiarities to it, but they're following Spanish or French traditions, like Louisiana, Texas, which was Mexico at one time. Those are all community property states. Not so important that you have to recognize which states are community property and which states are not. Just understand that Utah is not. But it is important to have just a basic feeling that in a community property state, you could have separate or you could have joint property. The rules of having separate property are perhaps you owned it before you got married, or perhaps you acquired it with the sale of the proceeds from a sale of another property that was separate, and you bought another separate property. But you have to keep meticulous records to prove what is community and what is not, because in a community property state, if one spouse's name is on the title, it doesn't mean they own it in severalty. It doesn't mean that they own it alone. In a community property state, even though one spouse's name is on the title, it could very well be, if that property was treated like community property, that it's owned by both. So kind of an interesting situation there. It comes up once in a while in your practice where you have owners that live in Idaho, Arizona, or perhaps California, and they own property here. And they are used to, because they've been told by their attorneys in California, that both parties have to sign all the agreements. But you've listed a property here in Utah that only belonged to perhaps the wife. Maybe it was her parents' home that she inherited when they both died. Been renting it out for a while, and now they've decided to sell it and list it with you. Well, that's fine, but whose signature do you need on the listing contract? Well, Utah is not a community property state. We go by something called situs here, S-I-T-U-S, which means that where the property is located, those state laws apply. Well, she lives in California, it's true, but her property's here in Utah. You only need her signature on the contracts. And when that property closes, her proceeds check will be made out in her name only. Now, her spouse in California might say, oh, no, you can't do it that way. We both have to sign, and that needs to be paid to both of us, and my attorney said so. Well, yeah, in regards to California property, but not Utah property. When partners don't see eye to eye, then there could be a situation where they have to part ways, and that could be a partition action. I mean, one of the most common partition actions is divorce, where a couple has decided not to be together any longer, and so the judge is going to decide what's going to happen with that property, or at least they're going to ratify what the owners decided to do. If they can't decide, then the judge will decide. But that's a partition action. But divorce is not the only one. It could be that 3 partners or 4 partners can't get along and they disagree, and so they appeal to the court to decide what's going to happen with their property. Typically, the judges order these properties sold and then the proceeds divided amongst the owners. But that's called a partition action. Another way of owning property in Utah is in severalty, but not with a breather, a flesh and bones individual, but a non-breather, an entity. Non-breathers could be like corporations, limited partnerships, LLCs, and the like. I call them non-breathers because they are a legal person, not a natural person. And so what happens is a corporation can own a property in their own name, or they could own a property with someone else. Now, obviously, you cannot own a property as a joint tenant if you're a non-breather. For example, a corporation cannot own 50% and then have a flesh and bones individual own the other 50% as joint tenants. Why? Well, it's unfair. Corporation never dies. LLC never dies. As long as you keep renewing your charter, they will last forever. So eventually they'll outlive the breather. They'll outlive the flesh and bones individual. And because of what? Yeah, that's right. The right of survivorship, then the corporation would eventually acquire total ownership. Unfair. So any entity, any legal person cannot own property as a joint tenant. Therefore, the only other type of common ownership or multiple ownership available to them is tenants in common.